So Jackson, we're still looking at your presenter view though. So just double check that and see if you want to get into full screen. Yep, now you're in full screen. So that's great. So, all right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to admit a few more people and we'll get going right at noon here. So thank you all for joining us today. For to learn a little bit more about transfer of development rights. My name is Barbara Richter, and I'm the executive director at the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. For those of you who don't know NHACC, we are a nonprofit organization working to support New Hampshire's conservation commissions so that they can be successful in protecting their local natural resources. Now, a lot of conservation commissions are interested in how they can fund their conservation projects and continually fund their conservation fund and to do the work that they do. And when I learned about transfer of development rights, I thought that this was a really interesting concept that would be worth just, going into more detail in one of our Lunch and Learn programs. So today's program is going to review the city of Dover and how they have evolved a transfer of development rights, or TDR, program over the past years. And I believe that this helps fund land preservation as well as some housing efforts too. So we'll have to look into more detail on that. But our presenters today are Adana Benton, who's the Director of Planning and Community Development in Dover, and Jackson Kaspari, who's the Resilience Manager in Dover. Donna, as I mentioned, is the Director of Planning and Community Development for Dover, and she's also President of the New Hampshire Planners Association. She's also worked in multiple roles in Dover since 2015. Highlights of her career include shepherding partnerships for new developments and expanding a community trail, revising and overseeing capital improvement programs, creating Dover's customer service center, and bringing arts and culture to the master plan and zoning ordinances. She's also worked in the town of Merrimack and Newmarket. She holds a Master of Public Administration, a Bachelor of Science in Tourism Planning and Development, and minors in Community and Environmental Planning and Environmental Resource Economics. And I'm going to quickly admit a few people, and we also have Jackson Kaspari with us. Jackson is the Resilience Manager for the city of Dover. And he's previously worked as the city's Resilience Coordinator and in various capacities as a University of New Hampshire Sustainability Fellow in 2018. He also completed a greenhouse gas and nitrogen inventory for the city and a inventory report for municipal and school operations. As Resilience Manager, Jackson is focused on three major topics: environmental project review, land conservation, and energy. So thank you both for joining us here today. I just want to do a quick tips on our program today before we get started. Just a reminder that we are recording this program, and I will make the recording available to all who registered. I'll send the link out tomorrow. And we do ask participants to please remain muted so that everybody can hear throughout the program. So check your screen on the bottom and please hit the mute button. We are going to invite you to ask questions. I think there's going to be a lot of questions and some great dialogue going today. So please feel free to put your question in the chat box. If we can't get to it right away, that way we'll ask it we'll be able to review it at the end of the program. Or at the end of the program, you have the opportunity to raise your hand in the reactions button, and we'll try to get to you live to ask your question at the end of the program. And so now I'd like to welcome Donna and Jackson from Dover to tell us more about how they established this program.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. So Jackson and I are going to tag team the presentation today. I'm going to start with kind of the more drier topics of what is transfer development rights and some of the definitions that we use in Dover, and then kind of how it came about, the history of the ordinance and the amendments to the ordinance, and then go over some recent amendments to that, and then how it's been able to increase the conservation funding in Dover. And then Jackson will go into how we're using that funding in some more recent projects, and then we're happy to answer any questions or have discussion. All right, so we're going to start with what development rights are, because we can't talk about transferring them until we know exactly what they are. So according to the Dover zoning ordinance, we define it as the legal claim to construct or develop specified land uses within specified densities and or dimensional limits as granted by the City of Dover zoning ordinance. So you can see that this is the Dover zoning map. So if you go back to the basics of thinking of a zoning ordinance, and there's different zoning districts in each city or town typically that allow for the different uses, different dimensional regulations. Some are more focused on residential, some might be more focused on downtown or businesses or commercial uses. In Dover, we have a lot of mixed use districts, but we also have, you'll see like the dark green is our R40. So that's our more rural zoning district. That is typically where like receiving or sending areas might be. And usually is the more rural in Dover, which means lot sizes have to be a minimum of 40,000 square feet. There's a lot of open space subdivisions, and that's just kind of your more rural feel. And you can see where kind of all the different labels congregate. That's getting into our downtown core. So if you've been to Dover, you know, we're right on the coast, heading towards Maine between Portsmouth and Rochester. And so we have a nice downtown. We're one of the oldest developments or oldest settlements in the country. We're number 7, but we're also the oldest in New Hampshire, celebrating our 400th this year. So we have like the mill buildings that have been redeveloped. So we have that mix of like your more dense downtown, and then also as you spread out more rural areas as well. So I'm going to start with some of those. So then what is transfer of development rights? So per the Dover zoning ordinance, again, it means the conveyance of the development rights of a parcel of land by deed or other legal instrument approved by the planning board to the developer or another parcel. Said legal instrument shall be recorded at the Stratford County Registry of Deeds. So as a planner, I also will refer to the American Planners Association's dictionary a lot. And this definition is kind of a good combination of several of their definitions from around the country that I was looking at. So when we talk about TDR, transfer development rights, we often hear about sending and receiving areas. So again, per our ordinance and per most ordinances around the country, the sending area means the defined area within the TDR district from which development rights are transferred, resulting in permanent preservation of lands possessing significant conservation features. And then the receiving area is receiving those development rights. So that's more defined within the TDR district to which the development rights are transferred, resulting in more efficient and intense use of suitable development sites. So in trying to not get kind of the sprawl and having random developments, the sending areas obviously send their development rights. So I tried to make a little graphic with the green. You think of the trees and the wetland protections, whereas the receiving areas are more of your dense areas that probably have the public water and sewer and the infrastructure that would allow for that density. So TDR in Dover has pretty much evolved. We added it into our zoning ordinance in 1990. And we really focused then on the receiving and sending areas. So the receiving area was east of the Spalding Turnpike, which you can see kind of has the spine through the city in the R12 and the R40. So again, that's our residential districts with a 20,000 square foot minimum lot size or a 40,000 square foot minimum lot size. And then the sending area was on the west side of the Spalding Turnpike in all non-R40 and R20 districts. In 2018, we revamped it and added an opportunity to pay into the conservation fund instead of doing like the land swap. This was determined by a rate that we look at every year based off of acres that we preserve and figure out how much per acre it would kind of cost to conserve land so that you can have a development right or a unit per acre conserved. But instead of actually finding the land to preserve, you can now pay into the conservation funding. And then in 2020, we amended it again and added in the option for HUD restricted rentals to have the $0 TDR fee. In 2018, to give you an idea, the full unrestricted unit, which I'll get into in a minute, started at $13,402 per unit to pay into the conservation fund. And now we're up to $15,000 per unit based off those analysis that we do yearly, or Jackson does yearly. And then we also made changes to just make it a little bit more user-friendly because it's a ordinance that a lot of people read and have a hard time understanding. And then we also added in the residential density bonus for new industrial users over 40,000 square feet. And then again, this year we adopted amendments to clarify the waiver process because we do see some waiver requests for the TDR ordinance, as well as we amended slightly the criteria that the planning board would have to look at when they're voting on the transfer development right request. So some just basics, if you want to find our code, you just can go onto that website or go onto our city page, find the zoning ordinance, and then you scroll down to chapter 170. And then it's section 27.2, which is about 110 pages into our zoning ordinance if you want to take a read through that. And then we also have a handout that we can maybe send to you afterwards about TDR in general. So we do provide again for the traditional TDR with the sending and receiving areas, but then we also have added in the opportunity to pay into the conservation fund, which we've seen a lot of benefits and a lot of developers using that. And then, so as I started to talk about earlier, the TDR fees can be varied based on the size of the unit and if they're going to be HUD restricted to the fair market HUD rates. So again, if you just want to add another unit beyond what your density allows for the zoning, that would typically be now $15,000 per unit. That fee comes down if you're willing to size restrict it and put a deed restriction on the property and say, okay, if you're limiting this residential unit to 1,400 square feet, that's a different fee. 1,000 square feet would be a different fee, and then 600 square feet. And that was to try to get some affordability in Dover using that. And then we've also both have it for residential TDR and industrial TDR. And then depending on the zone, the overlying density to know how much you want to add to the lot compared to what's just allowed is either figured out through a yield plan, looking at the zoning of the underlying district and figuring out how many units you can meet per the existing zoning for that lot, or through a calculation, which I'll walk you through in a minute. All right, so here is an example. One column kind of looks at that you can purchase the units, like I just said, with the different size restrictions. It also then, because it's a deed restriction, means that people can't say, oh, I'm going to keep it to 1,400 square feet unit and then come back later and revise their basement or put on an addition. And then the formula that I was just talking about is on the other column. So for certain zoning districts, instead of using the underlying yield plan type of form, we do this formula. And so the formula was derived that you take the square foot area of the parent lot that you're looking at, and you remove the environmental constraints, and that becomes your base. And then you remove another 15% for basically the road area, drainage needs, and that type of thing. And then there's also a sliding scale depending on the amount of wetlands and unsuitable development area per the site. So that this example uses the 0.85, but that table's in our zoning district to figure out which percentage for this third step you would use. You multiply that and you get your development area, and then you divide that by your minimum lot size in Dover, and that would give you the base number of units. Then anything over the base number of units you're allowed would be TDR units. And that's what you would pay into the conservation fund for. So I'll go over an example, which was one of our first in 2018 that we looked at after TDR was revised and you could pay into the conservation fund. So this is a lot where you typically could get 4 units based off the formula we just went through. And instead they are asked for 6 units. The existing house they converted into a duplex and then added 4 additional units. Providing that density, this is walkable to the downtown. It met kind of the area requirements. At this point, we were doing like a neighborhood analysis where the developer or their engineer and the applicant would have to look at a surrounding area and kind of figure out what the lot sizes are and the density based off rather than just zoning about does it fit into the neighborhood. So this is an example of that. And then another more recent example is also, this is right by Wentworth Douglas Hospital. If you've been in Dover, again, walkable to the downtown, has city services right nearby. And this is one where you had an existing house that they ended up keeping, but then also building a duplex next door and then a 4-plex behind. So you can see there's a parking lot area, and then they were able to add the extra density where it made sense downtown and instead paid into the conservation fund so that then the Open Lands Committee can use that conservation funding and preserve land where it makes more sense, where the wetlands are more important or there's wildlife and they can kind of go through their criteria. It connects to other land, etc. So basic transfer development rights of figuring out where it makes more sense to have the density in the units versus kind of where it makes more sense to have that preserved land so that you're avoiding the sprawl. So why implement TDR? Obviously, with you all being Conservation Commission members, conservation land is very important. I don't need to tell you that, but it allows for the density to make sense where it should be located versus where land should be better protected. Obviously, it promotes healthy living, community building, economic development, but it also allows, at least in our case, the creativity and diversity in projects that we're seeing, and kind of making better use of land use in general and making that more efficient. And then of course it ties into our master plan and everything we're standing for in Dover. So with that, I will turn it over to Jackson, I think. There we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Donna. That was a great introduction to the specifics of TDR and how it's evolved over the years. And for my portion of the talk, I'll be diving into 4 examples of recent conservation projects that have been made possible through the TDR funding mechanism. So to start with an overview to sort of orient both regionally and within Dover where these projects are located, you see a map on the screen here. So one of the projects, which is a little bit unusual, is actually close to the urban core. So I'm going to talk about that one first. And then there's 3 other projects that are conservation easements that are in more typical locations for conservation land that we see in Dover, 2 on the north end of Dover close to the Rochester line, and another on the south end of Dover near the Bellamy River. So to start with the first one I mentioned near the urban core, this is the Arch Street property. And for all of these conservation projects, I'm going to walk through, some of the features, the price, and next steps that are involved, just to let you know. So this was a fee simple purchase. The city of Dover purchased this outright, so it's not a conservation easement, but that purchase was made with conservation funding and for conservation related intentions. So it was purchased for $380,000, which was discounted from the appraised value. So we reached a negotiation with the seller who previously owned the adjacent lot as well, which has since been sold. The closing costs for this came out to approximately $6,500. And this was a 10-acre project. So the total cost per acre came out to $38,648. And the reason there was focus put on this property, right? The Open Lands Committee, as Donna mentioned, first goes through a pretty rigorous criteria evaluation, which involves a site visit and scoring 21 criteria to come up with a recommendation of whether or not to pursue a conservation project once that initial conversation with the property owner has commenced. And then eventually they take this criteria recommendation, if they want to proceed, to the Conservation Commission for a funding request once there's either a purchase and sales agreement in place or a donation and acceptance agreement. So there's 21 steps overall in this process, a lot of moving parts. I'm not going to get into all those details, but just to give you a sense of what's involved. And many of you are probably familiar with how this works in your own communities. So this was pursued because of some good conservation features in that it was close to the Dover Community Trail, close to one of our schools as well. So there may be an opportunity for some school-based activities on this property. It contains a significant wetland area, which would have made any development on this property challenging for those reasons. Plus, it had some supporting wildlife landscape, and there's been sightings of plenty of deer, owls, and hawks, and other critters throughout the property over time. We use mapping tools to look at soil quality. So this contained prime farmland soils. And a unique feature of this acquisition is that it does allow for public access, which is great. And so while the initial intention was really for the conservation value of the property, that was another major component of this as well. And right now, the Open Lands Committee is formed a small group of members to go walk the property, assess the conditions on site as they presently are, and then identify potential improvements for this piece for public benefit, right? So we may see someday a passive recreation, trail system here, maybe a small picnic area. But we're being really neighborly throughout the process and keeping the abutting properties, in the know as things advance. So these next three projects have not yet closed, but are public and are very close to closing. And like I mentioned before, wouldn't really be possible without a consistent funding stream in the conservation fund. So this first one is the Ecola property, which again is a conservation easement. It was great working with the Ecolas on this, as they're willing to donate their development rights to the city for the conservation easement, which is a bit over 10 acres, 10.39 in total. You can see on the map to the right the area that is proposed for the easement versus the area which would be unencumbered and remaining out of the easement, a bit over 2.37 acres to be exact there. And the closing cost for this one to reach an agreement with the landowners came out to $21,000. So there was still a request to the Conservation Commission for funding as part of this, and the city has agreed to hire a surveyor to conduct the easement boundary survey work, considering that this, again, is a donated project, which is great. So the cost per acre is quite low for this one. It came out to a little over $2,000. Some great conservation features for this piece, abuts existing conservation easement that we monitor annually. It has close proximity to Blackwater Brook, which is off the map here, but is nearby. And it contains some of the highest ranked wildlife habitat in New Hampshire, according to the Wildlife Action Plan for New Hampshire. As well as using our mapping tools, we found that there was, prime farmland soils as well as soils of statewide importance. So for next steps on this one, right, we have a signed donation acceptance agreement, and we've received funding authorization from the Conservation Commission as well as interest accepted by the City Council. So we're just looking to get a surveyor to conduct an easement boundary survey and should be going out for quotes on that fairly soon. This is the Stockbauer property, another conservation easement project working through the process now. This purchase price was fairly high for a conservation easement, but was based off a certified appraisal that was conducted. And actually, the $556,000 for the 9.52 acres was discounted from the appraised value, which was over 600,000. So it was great to work with the landowners here on reaching a negotiated price. The closing costs are estimated to be somewhere around 11,000. They are estimated because this project has not yet closed, bringing the cost per acre to the 59,559 you see there. But again, I mean, there's a lot of excitement over this piece because the Open Lands Committee, which was formed in 2000, had been eyeing it for a number of years because it is surrounded by existing conservation land, which isn't designated here, but there's a piece owned by the city of Dover. To the other side, there's property owned by New Hampshire Fish and Game, and it's right near the Bellamy River Wildlife Management Area, which is hundreds of acres, the largest contiguous conservation tract in Dover, owned and operated by New Hampshire Fish and Game. So again, good farmland soils as well, and some really good conservation features overall. This property does still have a mortgage on it. So as part of that process, which many of you may be familiar with, in order to get an easement, the owners must maintain or obtain, excuse me, a mortgage subordination. And so we're working with them on that now and helping them compile all the documentation they need to give to their lender as part of that. This is the last easement project I'll mention. It's the Lombard property up in the very northeast corner of Dover near the Rochester and Somersworth lines. And the purchase price for this one, 175,000, which matched the appraised value. As many of you may be familiar, I should mention these appraisals are a little bit different than your typical appraisals in that they're a before and after valuation. So it's what's the value before the conservation easement, and then what's the value after the easement, and then that difference is the associated cost of basically acquiring those development rights from the property owner to permanently protect that piece. And so the closing costs are a bit higher on this one at 25,000 because to reach a negotiation with the landowners, we offer to cover the costs of the easement boundary survey there, which is sometimes part of the deal we make with folks. The acreage for this one, again, 10.29. So all of these are somewhat similar in size here. And the cost per acre coming out to, close to 19,500. So some really good conservation features on this piece as well. Again, surrounding by existing conservation land. There's City of Dover owned wellhead protection land in this field here. And then the two surrounding properties, the one across the street and the other one over on this side, have some pretty large conservation easements on them. It has some of the highest ranked wildlife habitat in New Hampshire, and the property owners could tell you all of the wildlife they've run into, including black bears in recent years. And it contains, like the other projects I mentioned, good soil qualities as well. So this one has been approved for funding by the Conservation Commission, but has not yet obtained City Council authorization. So that will be the next step to move this forward. So to summarize those projects, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussions, right? These recent projects comprise 40.2 total acres. And we're finding more and more projects that are in the 10-acre range. I think that's pretty common in Dover these days. A lot of the really large tracts have either been protected already or have been developed over the years. But the total conservation fund request for all of these is north of $1 million. And a lot of that funding really did come from TDR, which, as Donna has mentioned, has been a great way for Dover to balance density where it makes sense, because we obviously have a housing crisis we're dealing with as well, along with providing critical funding to make these projects possible through the work of the Open Lands Committee advising the Conservation Commission. I want to give a shout out to them. They're obviously integral to this entire process, and it wouldn't be possible to do this work without their efforts. And I wanted to specifically, I don't know if she's on this call, but mention Anna Boudreau as well, because she was critical in some of the initial work for transfer development rights in Dover, and has been really leading the way for the OLC for 20 years now. So I work with her all the time on this stuff. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I think we'll thank you all for your time, and NHACC for inviting us to give a presentation today and open it up to questions and discussion.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We do have a couple questions. I wanted to just clarify a couple things. The first question I had was, you focused a lot on the funding that was available. Did you end up doing a lot of the actual the swap, in a sense, where you would have receiving parcels and giving parcels? Was that effective, or do you feel that really this is just more effective as a funding source?
So we saw some of that in like the 90s and early 2000s, and then it kind of went stagnant. And we had the TDR ordinance under the zoning ordinance, but no one was really using it again until 2018, when we offered the buy-in option where you pay into the conservation fund. So we do have instances really like in our industrial parks where we see the sending and receiving areas. But I would say for several decades, most people weren't using the TDR ordinance when it was just sending and receiving areas.
Okay, great, great. But it's interesting to see how it's evolved and how it has become an opportunity to protect more land. So the first question we got was, were the recent examples in areas with city water and sewer?
They were. So the one of the criteria of having an opportunity to use the TDR ordinance is that it is a property that has public water and sewer. Obviously, I think there's probably a lot of smaller communities here that might not have as much public water and sewer in your communities. I do think there's an option to be able to create an ordinance that still provides for the pay-in option, just figuring out the land area needed for the private well and septics.
And I noticed you mentioned walkability a lot. So I think, is that part of the criteria as well, if it's walkable to downtown? Or
Yes, in the way that one of the criteria is that it's consistent with our master plan, and obviously walkability and alternative transportation is a big part of our master plan.
okay, gotcha. All right. And then there was a question about closing costs. Why are the closing costs so high for the Ecola donated property? And I know sounds like there's a lot of survey costs, but
Yeah, that's exactly. You were right about that. We budgeted for the survey as part of that request because since they were donating their development rights, we said, okay, we'll agree to cover the cost of the survey for you.
great. And I imagine legal costs are probably in a lot
Yes.
of that as well.
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. Yep.
And is the city of Dover then holding these conservation easements, or are you working with the land trust, or?
Yeah, so all the projects that I just mentioned, we plan to hold those ourselves. So there's no outside participation. I mean, certainly we collaborate with land trust organizations like SALT very regularly, and we do have a lot of easements that have either primary interest from SALT or another organization, or secondary interests, which we monitor annually. But yeah, no, all of these were done just on the city side, which I think is one of the nice things about TDR funding being available, is that communities can tackle a lot of this self as long as they have the capacity to put into
Right.
these efforts.
And
Yeah.
because you have an open lands committee that's been
Mhm.
around for a long time and has a lot of really talented members, I think that has made this successful. I wouldn't encourage every town to just jump in if they don't have a lot of kind of good history with
Mhm.
land protection
Yeah,
projects.
that's a really good point. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So a tangential question. What is the mission of your open lands committee? And you know what I think would also be great is if we could share the criteria that you have for land protection as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with an email to you, Barbara, giving you that criteria sheet. I mean, I think it's really useful for scoring the projects, and just gets the whole committee and Conservation Commission thinking more about, why are we doing this? What are the good reasons here?
Right.
So that, yeah. And to go back to the question about the mission, I don't have the mission state memorized off the top of my head, but really the mission of the Open Lands Committee is to advise the Conservation Commission on preservation of open space and to assist with, monitoring efforts as well of that open space. So that's their primary function.
Okay. Is there a stewardship planned and fund for the easements? And that's a very good question, because I know a lot of land trusts require a stewardship fund or endowment fund to be part of the transaction cost. So how are you dealing with stewardship?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we don't have a dedicated stewardship fund, and Donna, feel free to chime in here. I mean, we do have a portion of the planning department budget that could be used for consultants. Fortunately, we haven't had to rely on that for monitoring due to staff knowledge over the years. Steve Bird was excellent at coordinating all those monitoring efforts in the past, and I was fortunate to be able to learn from him before he retired from the department on how to take on some of that work. And we have some very engaged volunteers on our Open Lands Committee that are willing to go out and monitor these properties. So we handle it in-house at this time, and we make sure we obviously get the properties done that we need to report out on annually, and then try to expand to other properties that haven't been monitored in some time if time allows for those. So
Okay, it sounds like you mostly answered the next question that came in, that you do have an annual monitoring or stewardship review for the property,
yes,
right?
yes, we do.
And then, so who's the responsible party behind that? Is that the city or the open space committee?
I guess it's both, right? Because the Open Lands Committee is the advisory volunteer body that takes on that responsibility. But as their staff person, I mean, it's really part of my core functions to make sure that that's running smoothly.
Oh, great. Is there anybody out there who would like to raise their hand and ask a question? There's a lot to take in. I think the formula was one of the things that I felt was a challenge, but I think once you probably get more involved in reading that ordinance and understanding kind of where those numbers come from, it makes more sense. But if you have any other questions, feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask those questions directly, or raise your hand if you want. But I think at this time, unmuting and asking directly is perfectly fine. All right. Well, I think there was a lot of info going on. So maybe people are going to, yeah.
This is Paul Wainwright. Sorry, I just figured out how to unmute. Either Jackson or Donna, when you talk about paying a certain amount of money into the conservation fund per unit, is that per foundation or per bedroom?
That would be per foundation, or if it's a duplex with one foundation, it would be per unit. So it's per dwelling.
Okay, per dwelling. I think you had some size limits, so you can't have a dwelling with 10 bedrooms, for example.
You just pay the full TDR rate and you for that. So, and you'd have to show the planning board how you meet the criteria and that you're not just trying to skirt another way of zoning.
Yeah, I also sit on my planning board. That's why I'm asking it from a planning board's perspective.
Yeah.
That's it.
Donna, do you have additional regulations for ADUs?
We do, yep. So we have our own ordinance for accessory dwelling units as well.
And does that fit into this plan? I mean, if people wanted to put, I mean, are you looking at doing more than one? I see that the state is looking at allowing people to do more than one ADU on a property.
We do. So we're the first in New Hampshire that have allowed more than one ADU per property or per house, but the second one does have to fall under HUD rent restrictions. And the ADUs, so there are options. You can do an ADU, you could do a duplex on your lot, or you could do TDR. the ADUs needs to be, one of the units needs to be owner occupied. They need to share the same utilities. There's size restrictions, so it has to be minimum of 300 feet or a maximum of 800 feet. So you do have kind of a checklist you'd have to go through to make sure you're meeting the ADU requirements. And then there's also a notice of restriction that you have to fill out that you won't kind of turn around and rent it and that type of thing.
Great,
So-
thank you.
For those who don't know, it's accessory dwelling unit is an ADU. So often they used to call them like mother-in-law apartments type of things like that. That's what we're talking about here. And I guess that's my other kind of question is, if your zoning is going to be, rezoned to allow for more density, would that then make this, would that kind of throw a wrench in how this works? Like, so in other words, you have to have areas that are limited in their density in order to be allowed to increase density. So I know a lot of communities are looking at their density levels and considering increasing areas, building on areas that have increased amount of density. So I guess you don't want to be a community that automatically allows this higher density, because then you wouldn't have that opportunity to basically provide funding or exchange for the more rural areas of your community to be protected.
Yeah, I mean, it's a balancing act, right? So you need to figure out in your community where it makes more sense for kind of the residential areas or the more rural areas, but even the rural areas or the more dense areas, there's always the opportunity that people are looking to do more units than are allowed by zoning. So our central business district, like our core downtown, doesn't really have a density limit. The only thing that you have to prove is that you can park enough parking spaces on site to have a car. So that's kind of where our density comes from in the downtown. But then just beyond that, in our gateway district, it's like 1 unit per 4,000 square feet for the most part. There's some exceptions to that. But so we've been seeing TDR requests a lot in the gateway district that can't meet that 1 per 4,000, want the extra units. It has public water and public sewer, so they pay into the conservation fund, and then we can use that money elsewhere to conserve land.
Okay.
So certainly,
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Theis.
The Fish and Game Department specifies that a home range of a single bobcat is 27 square miles. Now, there's a difference between conserving land as a corridor for animals to move through, as opposed to conserving lands of a size sufficient to provide a living space on a permanent basis for wildlife. 10 acres, unless it connects to a larger portion of land or provides a corridor to access larger portions of land, doesn't seem to me to be sufficient to provide that much of a place for wildlife to live.
I mean, that is a good point. These, on the face of land protection projects, these look like a smaller parcel. But obviously you have that criteria. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how the decision to have those smaller parcels.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I mean, like I mentioned before, one of the things is you have to work with a willing landowner, right? That's interested. The other piece of this is like you mentioned, the criteria. We look at existing proximity to existing conservation land as being a key component of that. And the goal is to create these protected wildlife corridors. So 3 of the projects, the conservation easements, all 3 of those are connected to existing conservation land, helping to extend wildlife corridors that are already present that comprise, 50 or more acres. So yeah, we definitely evaluate that as part of this. I mean, it's a good point, but you'd be surprised in the amount of wildlife you see even on the R Street property. That's its own kind of standalone 10-acre piece that, while it doesn't connect to vast swaths of other conservation land, you still have this diverse population of wildlife that are taking refuge there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, any other questions from the group? Or any final comments from Donna or Jackson? Again, if you could send me the most updated Dover criteria. I do have a criteria from Dover, but it might be a couple years old, so I want to make sure I've got the most recent one.
Okay.
And you also mentioned that you have a handout or some guidance information on TDR. So if you send me that, that would be great. And then the mission or any other information on the Open Lands Committee. And then I can send that in the follow-up email to those who registered along with a recording, so people can go find out more information. I'll also be sending the link to the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, and they have a transfer of development rights chapter in their toolbox book. So I think that will be that will give you a little more information on transfer of development rights. And I believe they talk about Dover in that toolbox as well. So Dover's definitely the highlight here for New Hampshire when it comes to this practice. So yeah, do you have any other kind of closing comments that you'd like to talk about right now, or any other information that you'd recommend conservation commissions look into if they're trying to get a transfer of development right passed in their community?
I guess I'll just end with, Donna mentioned the history of this, so you have to be kind of persistent when it comes to these efforts and be willing to be adaptable over time to something like TDR as community needs evolve. And, trying to tie it in with the city's or town's master plan will get a lot of weight behind an effort like this. But we found it to be really successful so far, and it's exciting to see, how we're able to use this money for conservation projects while helping, with the housing crisis that we're experiencing in this area specifically. So Donna, I'll pass it over
Yeah,
to
I
you.
was going to say, and we're happy to answer any questions if people are looking into doing a TDR ordinance in your community. We're happy to kind of walk through some of the things that we've found might not have worked so well and that we have amended or would like to amend, and happy to be a resource to anybody. And thanks for having us.
Yes,
Great.
thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, that's great to know that we can rely on your experience if we have questions, or if towns are interested in learning more about how they can do that and what are the challenges and the opportunities in doing work like this. And maybe I just have one more question. We're just about finishing up here, but the comment that I heard was this came at a time in Dover when your land use change tax was kind of on the downturn, or you weren't getting as many properties that had, that were in current use and that were then being developed. Do you feel like this is a good alternative to land use change tax, or kind of supplement, or do you have any land use change tax insights for us?
Yeah, I can chime in, and if Donna wants to add on, feel free. So land use change tax still funds the conservation fund. So we still see some money flowing from land use change tax, although, the number of properties that are being taken out of current use, I think, has fluctuated over the years. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the core reasons for this was to help supplement the fund, since there wasn't as much money flowing from land use change tax, from what I understand.
Okay. Great. Well, that was something that I do know a lot of communities, especially in that southeast, southern New Hampshire, they're not seeing the amount of land use change tax go into their conservation fund as they did in the past. And unfortunately, that doesn't mean there's, development's not happening. It's just already less than the 10 acres. So great. Well, again, I want to thank you both for for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us here today. And as a reminder to the group, I will be sending out the links and more information on transfer of development rights tomorrow morning with the recording. So you can always share this with other commission members if you like, or if you have any other information, any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to Donna or Jackson, and we'll make sure we get you those resources you're looking for. So everybody, you get an extra 10 minutes today in your lunch hour where you can go and enjoy and maybe get out of the rain before it hits southern New Hampshire. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon, and you'll be hearing from me tomorrow. Have a good one.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you.